Good morning. Today we're privileged to have Captain Haynes with us. He's a Texas A&M graduate, Marine Corps flight instructor, and a 35-year veteran of United Airlines. I think everyone probably remembers that on July 19, 1989, United Flight 232 departed Denver at about 2:09 p.m. climbed uneventfully to a cruise altitude of about 37,000 feet, and at approximately 3:16, the flight notified the Air Traffic Control Center that the number 2 engine had failed. The aircraft was only marginally stable at that point, and this is the rest of the story now.
Got an emergency for you. All right. I got a United aircraft coming in, lost number 2 engine, having a hard time controlling the aircraft right now. He's at a 29,000 right now and descending to Sioux City right now. He's east of your VOR, but he wants the equipment standing by right now.
Radar contact.
Okay, so you know we have almost no controllability. Very little elevator and almost no aileron. We're controlling the turns by power. I don't think we can turn right, but I think we can only make left turns. Well, we're starting a little bit of a left turn right now. I mean, we can only turn right, we can't turn left.
United 232 Heavy, understand, sir, you can only make right turns?
That's affirmative.
232 Heavy, say souls on board and fuel remaining.
We have 37.6 fuel and we're counting the souls.
Roger. United 232 Heavy, Sioux City.
We have no hydraulic fluid, which means we have no elevator control, almost none, and very little aileron control. I have serious doubts about making the airport. Have you got someplace near there that we might be able to ditch? Unless we get control of this airplane, we're going to put it down wherever it happens to be.
United 232 Heavy, roger. Stand by 1. United 232 Heavy, say again. 232 Heavy, do you think you'll be able to hold about a 240 heading?
Yeah, we're trying to turn to it right now.
Roger. When you get turned to that 240 heading, sir, the airport will be about 12 o'clock at 38 miles.
Okay, we're trying to control it just by power alone now. We have no hydraulics at all, so we're doing our best here.
Roger, and we've notified the equipment out in that area too, sir. The equipment's here on the airport standing by, and they're sending some out to that area.
We're going to have to continue one more right turn. We've got the elevators pretty much under control within 300 or 400 feet, but we still can't do much of the steering.
United 232 Heavy, roger. Understand you do have the elevators possibly under control. We've got to hold altitude.
Negative. We don't have it. We are better, that's all.
Roger. United 232 Heavy, there's a small airport at 12 o'clock and 7 miles. The runway's 4,000 feet long there.
Hey, I'm controlling it myself right now. As soon as the captain gets back on, he'll give me a hand here. He's talking on PA.
Roger.
Okay, United 232, we're starting a left turn back to the airport. Since we have no hydraulics, braking is going to really be a problem. I would suggest the equipment be towards the far end of the runway. And I think under the circumstances, regardless of the condition of the airplane when we stop, we're going to evacuate. So you might notify the ground crew equipment that we're going to do that.
United 232 Heavy, Wilco, sir, and if you can continue that left turn to about a 220 heading, sir, that'll take you right to the airport. United 232 Heavy, you're going to have to widen out just slightly to your left, sir, to make the turn to final, and also that'll take you away from the city.
Whatever you do, keep us away from the city.
United 232 Heavy, been advised there is a 4-lane highway up in that area, sir, if you can pick that up.
Okay, we'll see what we can do here. We've already put the gear down, and we're going to have to be putting on something solid if we can.
United 232 Heavy, roger. The airport's currently at your 1 o'clock position, 10 miles. And United 232 Heavy, if you can't make the airport, sir, there is an interstate that runs north to south to the east side of the airport. It's a 4-lane interstate.
We're just passing it right now. We're going to try for the airport.
United 232 Heavy, roger. And advise when you get the airport in sight.
Got the runway in sight. We'll be with you very shortly. Thanks a lot for your help.
United 232 Heavy, the wind's currently 360 at 11, 360 at 11. You're cleared to land on any runway.
You want to be particular and make it a runway, huh?
010 at 11, and there is a runway that's closed, sir, that could probably work too. The south, it runs northeast to southwest.
Pretty well lined up on this one, or I think we will be.
All right.
Yep.
United 232 Heavy, roger, sir. Yeah, that's a closed runway. That'll work, sir. We're getting the equipment off the runway, and they'll line up for that one.
How long is it?
At the end of the runway, it's just a wide open field, so, sir, so the length won't be a problem.
Okay. Isolate this. Plane of 19, he's coming down real fast down the south end. Okay, all right, stand by. He's on fire. Down. 419, engine 3, engine 4. All right, emergency equipment. Car 19 is, come on, give us a hand out here. The aircraft is down. And so all of them come in the same body on the station. We're going to the fence. Go ahead.
Well, but what situation out there?
Well, the plane is completely demolished on the ground.
10-4, you're going to need a lot of additional assistance out there, it sounds like.
10-4, I got engine 3, engine 5, and truck 3. I'm going out to the scene now. I'll advise you in just a few minutes.
10-4, I'm going to go ahead and go en route out there to the command post. Let me advise anything that you need. I'll have the comm center go ahead and notify emergency hospitals and also the ambulance.
It's my sincere pleasure to introduce to you the person that you heard on that video and that you saw land the plane, Captain Al Haynes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Land is a rather loose term for that. Thank you. Anyone who has seen this video seems to have just this one question in their mind, and that is, how did anyone survive an accident of that magnitude? And I think there are 5 factors that contribute to the degree of success that we had in Sioux City. That is luck, communications, preparation, execution, and cooperation. And I would like to talk about those 5 things today. First of all, we all have our own personal beliefs and convictions, and I would never intrude on yours, so for the sake of discussion, we call our first factor luck. You may call it whatever you wish. But what did luck have to do with it? Well, first of all, how did we get the airplane to Sioux City? We're an aviation-oriented audience here tonight. You basically have the idea of how an airplane works. When the number 2 hydraulics on the DC-10 blew, or the number 2 engine blew, it took out the number 2 accessory drive section, which took out the hydraulics for the number 2 system, and some 70 pieces of shrapnel penetrated the horizontal stabilizer and severed the number 1 line and the number 3 line. As a result, we ended up with no hydraulics. Now, the DC-10, like a lot of aircraft today, and those that will be made in the future, has no cables going to the controls. You have no manual reversion to the airplane at all. The cables go to the servos, and then hydraulic pressure does your work. So in order to protect against the loss of all fluid, there are a lot of redundancies are built into the system. The DC-10, for instance, has 3 completely independent hydraulic systems. They have 2 engine-driven pumps per system, their own hydraulic reservoir, their own supply lines, their own return lines. They are not connected fluid-wise in any way. They are connected mechanically so that if the shutdown, say, the number 1 engine, the fluid in the number 3 system runs a motor that runs a pump in the number 1 system, and your pressure is built right back up, and that's all automatic. You don't do anything about it. Should you lose the fluid in the number 1 system through a leak in one of the components, you won't lose the 2 and 3 system because they're not connected together. And all the major component flight controls have at least 2, some of them 3, of the systems providing power to these controls. And then we have, at the last resort, an air-driven generator that drops out of the bottom of the fuselage and runs a motor in the tail that will provide hydraulic pressure to one of the systems. So Enough redundancy was built into the system to where the odds were placed at 1 to 10 to the 9th power, or 1,000,000,000 to 1, that a complete hydraulic failure would occur. And that is satisfactory to where it's considered fail-safe, if I guess is a word. Well, on July 19th, Murphy's Law caught up with us, and we did lose all three systems. And as a result, we had no ailerons to bank the airplane. We had no rudders to turn it, no elevators to control the pitch. We had no leading edge flaps or slats for slowing the airplane down, no trailing edge flaps for landing. We had no spoilers on the wing to help us get down or to slow down once we got on the ground. And on the ground, we had no steering, nose wheel or tail, and no brakes. So what we had is what we kind of went through today in one of the simulators. We had the throttles of number 1 and number 3 engine to control us. And by manipulating those throttles, we were able to somewhat control the heading by just skidding the airplane in a turn. And controlling the pitch was just about out of the question. We kept saying we think we had the elevators under control. We never had the elevators under control. We thought we did, but we didn't. And I'll get into that when I talk about reaction. So you see, with those two things to work with, one engine and another, just getting the airplane on the ground was a tremendous piece of luck. Amazing. Because it has been tried again and it didn't work. So everything had to work in the right sequence, and it happened to work, and so we got the airplane at least to an airport. Another piece of luck was where we were. We could have been halfway to Honolulu, or we could have been over the Rockies, or we could have just been taking off from, say, New York. It used to be called, it's Kennedy now, isn't it? Kennedy Airport, and right over Manhattan. And so you see what the trouble we could have had. As it was, we were over the relatively flat lands of Iowa, and all of us in the back of our minds, you heard me say on the tape, I have serious doubts about making the airport. Well, there were times when all four of us had serious doubts about making the airport. But we knew in the back of our mind that where we were, if we had to ditch, we could probably find some fairly flat land, and we might have a chance of survival. So that relieved a lot of pressure on us in whether or not we're going to make the airport. At least we could get it on some pretty flat ground. Another piece of luck in our case. The weather was an amazing piece of luck. I just tried to fly the F-15 simulator under moderate turbulence, and man, if we'd have had to try to control this DC-10 under any kind of turbulence, we'd have never made it. If you are familiar with the weather in the Midwest, from the Canadian border down to the Gulf of Mexico in the summertime, there's usually a line of thunderstorms that are doozies. Today there were none, or that day there were none. We had one little buildup that we went around, but the rest of it was clear skies. 4,500 scattered, and about 10 miles visibility was the weather. So that was amazing that the weather was that good. A year to the day later, when we went back for a memorial service, there was a huge thunderstorm over Sioux City, directly over the airport. Had that been there a year before, we would never have made the airport. So the weather was a tremendous factor. The time of day was also very advantageous in two ways. One, it was day. We could see what we were trying to find. To try to find an airport 70 miles away at night over strange territory would be very difficult. By having, especially if we'd been runway 22, because there are no lights on that runway. It's a closed runway and it's not used, and so the lights aren't operative. As it was daytime. We could see what we were doing. We found the airport about 4 or 5 miles out. We were able to see it and able to direct ourselves in that general direction. So that was very important. But more important to the time of day was it was right at shift change time for the hospitals. Marion Health Center, which happens to be a regional trauma center, and St. Luke's, which happens to be a regional burn center, and are both located in Sioux City, were just changing their shifts. And so they were double shifted for our arrival. Not only that, but all of the clinics and health centers around town were all releasing their workers from work. And of course, with a 45-minute notice, or about a 30-minute notice that we're going to Sioux City, that was broadcast on the radio, and all these emergency services were able to head to the hospital. They had so many volunteers at the hospital, they had to turn them away. They had more than they can use. And our last piece of luck, which turned out to be very fortunate for the crew, you'll see why in a minute, it was Wednesday, the one day of the month when the Air National Guard in Sioux City is on duty, and 285 trained National Guardsmen were at the airport waiting for us when we got there. So you can see how the luck factor was way up here for us. Some of the other crews who've had accidents, the luck factor was down here. Our luck ran out about 50 feet in the air, but it lasted for a long time. So luck played a very important part in getting the airplane to Sioux City and having the survival rate that we did have. The second big factor was communications. We had quick response by ATC. Minneapolis Center was the one we were talking to. They quickly turned us over to this extremely calm young man that you just heard, Kevin Bachman. He's the controller that happened to be on the radar station at approach control when we turned it over. I met Kevin personally at the White House about a month later, and when I finally could talk to him, we couldn't say much the first time we met, but when I finally could, I found out that he had moved to Sioux City because he found his previous duty station too stressful, and he was looking for something a little quieter. I haven't the foggiest idea where he is now. He's not in Sioux City. But the calmness of his voice, the communications with him was outstanding. The DME did not work Sioux City that day, and although it's not on this tape, the cockpit voice recorder shows numerous times we're asking him where we were in relation to the airport and how far out. And he was right there every second giving us every bit of information. He picked out airports we could go to, runways or highways we could land on. Sioux City the Iowa State Patrol even blocked one of the freeways and had it open for us if we'd had to land on it, the one out by the airport. So communications in the air was tremendous. Probably what helped us the most was the fact that the second officer, Dudley Dvorak, I asked him to get a hold of San Francisco area maintenance. That's maintenance experts that are sitting in San Francisco for each type of equipment that United flies. They have all the computers, all the logbook history, all the history of the aircraft, and all the other information that they can draw on to help a crew that has a problem. Well, unfortunately, in our case, there wasn't anything they could help us with. Every time they tried to find something that we could do, we'd either already done it or we couldn't do it because we had no hydraulics. The hardest problem that Dudley had was convincing them that we didn't have any hydraulics. They'd say, oh, you've lost number 2. He says, no, we've lost all 3. Oh, you've lost number 3. No, we've lost all of them. Well, number 1 and 2 work. No. Yeah. So he went on like this for quite a while before he finally convinced them that we didn't have anything. And when we told them that, that was all they could do. And I was a little upset with him at first. When I first had Dudley stop communicating with him and turn around for the landing, I was a little ticked until I realized how frustrating it must be for those 4 or 5 people there with all these computers, all the knowledge at their fingertips that they could possibly draw on, and there's absolutely nothing they can do to help a crew. That's got to be extremely frustrating for them. And I have not yet had a chance to go down and see them and apologize for what I was thinking, but at least I didn't say it out loud. But Dudley's communication with him did 2 other things. It alerted our crisis center in Chicago, and it alerted our dispatch center in Chicago. And those 2 facilities, knowing that we were going to Sioux City, were able to prepare for our arrival in Sioux City. In fact, they pulled a 727 out of the hangar in Chicago, loaded it with people, and there just happened to be a meeting in our executive officers that day of our union and the company and some other people, and all those people that would be involved in accidents were at the center. And all they did was run and get on this airplane and fly to Sioux City. And they were there in Sioux City before I was admitted to my room in the hospital. So a very quick response by the company in getting support people and equipment there, all through the communications that Dudley was able to do. So that communications was very important. When we declared an emergency, which Bill did, the co-pilot, Bill Records, declared an emergency, everything stopped on the ground. Everything went to us. They cleared the frequency for us. They gave us all the help we could get. And I don't know how many light airplane pilots you have here today, but I've talked to several groups of private pilots, and this and you can pass on, Mary. They're afraid to say anything. They don't like to declare an emergency. They're afraid they're going to cause some problems or something like that. And then they said to me, well, you have all these resources of United Airlines at your disposal and the center and all this. So do you. 3 words. I'm declaring an emergency. And you've got it. All the help you want. You've got American Airlines maintenance facility. You've got United Airlines maintenance. If you stay in the air long enough, they'll patch you through to them and you can talk to them. So you've got all kinds of help if you just do that. Now, if you do that, and then land and nothing happens, you got a lot of reports to fill out, okay? And you're going to have a lot of airline pilots that are upset with you, especially if you go into a place like Chicago or something, because they're out holding now while they get you on the ground. And you'll probably hear about it. But in truth, and I've seen a lot of, when I've said this at the pilots and they all kind of shake their head, yeah, they're going to complain, but they're really glad you made it. And they're very happy for you that you were able to use the services available to you. So communicate with the ground, tell them your problem, and they'll help you. They really will. The communications in the cockpit among ourselves We'll talk about that under reaction that we talk about. The communications between the cockpit and the cabin, very little actually, because when I called the A flight attendant up, a very senior flight attendant, and she said she took one look in the cockpit and she knew that we didn't have an emergency. We had an enormous crisis. And her thought then was, we're at altitude, we've got some time, he told me to go back and prepare the cabin. I'll do that and I won't bother them. I'm sure he'll communicate with me again. And that's what happened. They didn't call us. We called them when we had a problem. We were ready to go. So that the communications, while it was not there, was good because it was not necessary. And the training did that. The intercommunications between the response units on the ground, this tape that you just saw is a 6-minute excerpt from a 54-minute tape called Alert 3. And there's about 15 minutes of communications on this tape prior to this crash that you saw. And there's a lot of ground communications between emergency response units and the hospital. Excellent communications in that respect. I'll grant you that the 20-minute warning time that we gave them, that we were coming to Sioux City, was a great help to them and a great benefit to them. If any of you serve on emergency rescue stuff or volunteer firefighters, you know that if you're in station and ready to go, it's a lot better than being home or something and having to respond. So the 20 minutes that we gave them, they were able to put their disaster plan into effect. In fact, I believe it was about 15 minutes before we crashed, the tower changed the alert from Alert 2, which is an aircraft is on the way with problems, to Alert 3. And Alert 3 means an airplane has crashed. That's how much confidence they had in us getting there. But 15 minutes notice of an airplane has crashed. So all the communications were put into motion for an airplane has already crashed. The hospital was notified. They began doing their thing. They called Des Moines and said, we're going to need more medical supplies. They were actually loading another Air National Guard plane in Des Moines and took it off shortly after we crashed, headed for the airport with supplies. So communications and advance notice, very, very important. The preparation. How do you prepare for something like this? I gave a talk in Anchorage to the Alaska Air Safety Foundation, and they subtitled my talk, Disaster in the Air, Are You Ready? And I said, no, you're never ready, but you might be prepared. And that's one of the reasons that I'm going around the country doing this, hoping that I can get the message out to be prepared. And the preparation for the ground crew, for the emergency rescue unit, was in 1987 they had a drill. They pretended that a wide-body aircraft crashed on this closed runway at Sioux City and had 150 survivors. And they had this drill, and they found some shortcomings in the drill, which most drills do. They have these once every 3 years, FAA mandated, live drill and a paper drill every year. And this was their year for their drill, and they decided to have a crash. They'd had a bus crash, I think, the time before. So in this airplane crash, they found a lot of things that they were short. One, they didn't take in enough community. If you're going to have 150 survivors, you're going to have more equipment than the class of airport that Sioux City is. It's not classified for wide-body aircraft, so they don't have to have quite the emergency response units that a larger airport would have to have. So they had to rely on the outlying communities. And Gary Brown, the Director of Services, brought these community people in, made them a part of his plan. They attended the meetings, they attended the practices that they were having, and everybody was putting their input into this plan. He also brought in a very important unit, the post-traumatic stress unit. Now, I was never one to believe much in post-traumatic stress. I've heard it from World War II and Vietnam and Korean veterans, and I thought, well, okay, if such a thing exists, I'll let it go because I don't really believe it. I believe it now, and I'm asking you to believe it. It may not have happened to you. I have been fortunate enough to not have suffered post-traumatic stress yet, but it can happen tomorrow. I was a little concerned about flying simulators under these conditions because I was afraid it might key something up. But no problem. I've been very fortunate. But it does exist, and it happens not to just victims of the crash. The 185th suffered a tremendous amount of post-traumatic stress. So did the actual people of Sioux City. So did the staff of the hospital. So post-traumatic stress has to start at the scene of the accident. And fortunately, Sioux City was prepared for that. That was part of their preparation and getting the things done. Because even though they practiced this wide-body aircraft that they didn't have, in July of 19, we put a wide-body aircraft on that very same runway that they used for practice. And we gave them 200 survivors to start with instead of 150. So having a drill, having a plan, and taking it seriously and working on it is very, very important for any community, no matter what size you are or who serves you. Up in Alaska, a lot of the pilots said, well, we're up here in the bush and we don't have these things. They're the main transcontinental stop for aircraft going to Japan. And an aircraft is not going to happen right over the major airport. It can happen anywhere out in the Tules. Not calling Sioux City a Thule, excuse me, I don't want to do that. But in Alaska, you got a lot of those up there. But it can happen anywhere. So everybody has to be prepared as they can be. And they were on the ground in Sioux City. They had a plan that they worked on, and they left some flexibility open in it so it could be changed. And when we get to the reaction, I'll talk about that also. The flight attendants, they were prepared by their training that we have at Chicago, Denver, and San Francisco. That's where flight attendants have their recurrent training. They go back once a year. They go through all the emergency drill preparation, how to open the doors and what they're all supposed to do, how to prepare the cabin, how to prepare the passengers. We have a 767 simulator in Denver that they've got about 40 seats in. And we'll go down during one of the sessions and we sit in that simulator, and several of the attendants are assigned the job of working. And about somewhere on takeoff or shortly after takeoff, we have a crash. The simulator tips over on its side. It fills up with smoke. It darkens just like it would on an airplane. There's fires outside some of the doors. It's very realistic. And that's the kind of training that they give the flight attendants, and it paid off. Each one of them, in a tape that they made later, said the training that we had and the training that we had, they kept saying it. So training is very, very important. Sometimes it's boring, sometimes it's repetitious, but it's very important. As far as the crew, there was no training procedure for hydraulic failure, complete hydraulic failure. We've all been through one failure or a double failure, but never a complete hydraulic failure. But the preparation that paid off for the crew was something that United Airlines started in 1980 called Cockpit Resource Management, or Command Leadership Resource Training, or any number of things that you want to call it. I think we called it CLR to start with. All the other airlines are now using it. Up until 1980, we kind of worked on the concept that the captain was the authority of the aircraft. Whatever he said goes. And we've lost a few airplanes because of that. Sometimes the captain is not as smart as we thought he was. And we would listen to him and do what he said, and we didn't know what he's talking about, right? Now, we had 103 years of flying experience up there in the cockpit trying to get that airplane on the ground. Not 1 minute of which we had actually practiced, any one of us. So why would I know more about getting that airplane on the ground under those conditions than the other three? So if I had not used CLR, if we had not let everybody put their input in, it's essentially we wouldn't have made it. It was, I don't know if any of you remember the old movie Marty. I kind of refer to that. It was Ernest Borgnine and a group of his cronies were trying to find something to do on a Saturday night. And they said, what do you want to do, Marty? And he said, I don't know. What do you want to do, Joe? I don't know. What do you? That's kind of the way we flew the airplane now. What do you want to do? I don't know. Let's try this. Okay. And you think that'll work? Beats me. So and that's just about the way it went, really. If you read the cockpit voice recorder or the transcript, there's a lot of that on there. What are we going to put the gear down? I don't know. How are we going to put it down? Well, we do two things. There's two ways to get it down. Which one are we going to use? That type of thing. So CLR really paid off. And CLR is being taken now into other areas. I think it was originally a management course anyway, but now it's being spread all over. I'm going next year to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania to talk to the Nuclear Power Association because they are beginning the CLR concept in their control rooms. They have 5 stations in a control room. You have a nuclear disaster. You want those 5 people working together. You don't want them working separately. So CLR that we had really prepared the crew for what happened. We used CLR. If you recall the Zip Top 737 over in Hawaii, the Aloha, Bob and Mimi used CLR to its utmost because they could not communicate with each other. They had to use hand signals and point to things they wanted to do. That's how they got that airplane on the ground. Flight 811, the 747 out of Honolulu on its way to Sydney, that blew the cargo door and lost 2 engines on the right side and did damage to the flaps and hydraulics. They used CLR to get the airplane back to Honolulu. They had a grossly overweight airplane that couldn't maintain altitude with 2 engines out on one side. And by using CLR and the crew working together and everybody putting their input in, they got the airplane back. The days of the captain being the ultimate authority is gone. He may be the authority on the airplane, he may sign for the papers and all this, but you don't work that way. I think Sister Margaret Wicks said it the best. She's from Sioux City, Briarcliff College. I'll talk about her in a minute. And her statement was, when you have a crisis like this and you've got so many diverse things going on, let those in charge take charge. Don't let one individual try to run the whole show. Let those who know how to do their specialties handle those things, and you'll get things done. And that's what happened. Execution. How did we execute? Well, first of all, how did we do it in the air? Not having any experience at all in flying an airplane under those conditions. Our basic problem was keeping the airplane in the sky and trying to find an airport. Besides losing all of our hydraulics, which gave us no control, we had two other problems. A problem that I was not really familiar with, maybe you are, I know an awful lot of your engineers here are. It's a term called phugoid. What a phugoid is an airplane wants to fly its trim speed. And as soon as you cut the power on one engine, you lose speed, the nose drops, airspeed starts to build, you'll go through that speed, the nose will come back up, you'll go through the speed again on the slow side, and you'll just oscillate like this. Maybe you can stop it, maybe you can't. The way you have to stop it, as we found out, not as much as we know now. A lot of this is after the fact knowledge. We weren't this smart in the air. But we found that in order to stop a phugoid, you had to do just the opposite of what you would normally do. When the aircraft reaches its apex and started down, you had to add power. As the speed built up, you had to actually add power to create lift in the wings to try and get the nose to pitch up. And the hardest thing to do, though, was as the nose started up and started to slow down, and you're approaching a stall, you had to close the throttles. And that's very difficult to do. We found out, though, that that's what we had to do. Another thing that led to our problem, though, was the damage to the tail was such that the aircraft wanted to constantly roll to the right. If we left the power alone, the aircraft would roll over. When the engine failed, Bill immediately took hold of the aircraft. Bill Records is a co-pilot, 26 years flying. He's been with National, Pan Am, and we came over to United when we acquired the Pacific flying. Very competent pilot. I'd flown with him the month before. I had no qualms about him flying at all. And when he grabbed a hold of the yoke, he demonstrated step number one in any emergency procedure, and that is somebody fly the airplane. Right? We've lost several airplanes because everybody was working on the problem and nobody was flying the airplane. One of them was down in the Everglades. Right? Everybody was working on the problem and the airplane flew into the ground. Right? Not to criticize the pilots, because it's just, everybody wants to do their share to get the problem solved. But somebody has got to fly the airplane. Bill immediately took hold of the airplane, immediately called ATC and said we lost an engine and had to get a lower altitude, was turning off the airway, all those things you're supposed to do. So my attention now is diverted to Dudley to shut the engine down. In United Airlines, we don't use much memory items. In emergency procedures, we use mostly checklists. And severe engine failure in flight failure or damage is all textbook. So Dudley got out his book, and the first thing he says is close the throttle. And when I tried to pull the throttle back, it wouldn't come back. Now, I've never shut an engine down in flight on a jet. So I didn't know that when you pull the throttle back, it didn't come back. In the simulator, when you do it, it always came back. This one wouldn't come back. Then he says, well, try the fuel. The next step is to shut the fuel off. I tried to shut the fuel off, and the fuel lever wouldn't move. So something was binding these controls. So we know that the damage to the tail, there is damage back there other than just the engine failing. We did get the fuel shut off by pulling down on the firewall shut-off, which shut off all electric and hydraulics to the engine. And then the fuel went off. Whether it was coincidental or whether it actually helped it, I don't know, but about that time it went off. Well, now we've been in about 15 or 20 seconds into our problem, and Bill says to me, Al, I can't control the airplane. Well, now I divert my attention from down here, shutting down the engine, to up here on the instrument panel. The first thing I noticed was Bill had full left aileron control, calling for a full left turn. You never would see that anywhere in the air in a DC-10, much less at 35,000 feet. He's also got the yoke right back in our lap. And the only time to do that is when they try to embarrass the captain on the ground by jerking back and hitting him in his fat stomach before he can get it out of the way. And that's never there in the air. See? So that catches my attention real quick. But what really got my attention was with the full left turn call for and a full nose up call for, we were in a descending right turn. And I tell all pilots around that this is when I said the dumbest thing that I ever said in my life. I said, I've got it. And I didn't have it very long. because we immediately determined that that's exactly, we could not control the airplane. It would not respond to the inputs of the crew. At this time, we were in a right bank. The bank was increasing. We got up to about 38 degrees of bank. We closed the number 1 throttle completely and firewalled the number 3 throttle, and very slowly the wing came back up. And 3 times in our attempt to get to the ground, we got to 38 degrees of bank. And we were doing just what those who have run this test that I went this morning and trying to fly an airplane with just the throttles, we were overpowering the airplane, over-controlling, because panic was one thing, although we didn't appear to be panicked. Not having any idea what we're doing was another. And an airplane about to roll over on its back at 35,000 feet is pretty scary, so you just do whatever you can to make it stop. But by manipulating the throttles this way, we kept the wings fairly level for a while, and then we had to start down. Well, we felt like everyone else that this cannot happen. You cannot lose all the hydraulics in a 10. That's been told us from time one. When we first sat down and they said, this isn't hooked up to anything as you move the wheel, we said, well, what's going to make it fly in case it, well, it can't happen. You can't lose all your hydraulics. And we believed it like everybody else. And although we were reasonably sure we weren't accomplishing anything with the yoke, we kept flying the yoke. The problem is it kept both of us to fly the yoke. We couldn't do it. Just one of us couldn't do it. Now, in flying the yoke with both hands, or with all 4 hands, now we had to operate the throttles, and we had to do them, let go of the yoke, move a throttle, let go of the yoke, move a throttle, and so forth. Had we known what we know now, I don't know if we could have let go of the yoke even now. To let go of the yoke completely is extremely difficult to do. After almost 40 years of flying airplanes and holding on to something, not having anything to hold on to is I don't know if we could do that. But we found out that it was very difficult to move the throttles. And I was about to have Dudley turn around and take over the throttles, and I'm glad we didn't, because we would have lost all that communications if he had. We were told there was a DC-10 captain in the back who was an instructor, and we like to think instructors know more than we do. So I figured maybe Denny knew something that we didn't, so we asked Captain Fitch to come up. Well, he took one look at the cockpit, and that's his knowledge, okay? He said, yeah, we're out of hydraulics. It's kind of funny reading the transcript, because he's about 15 minutes behind us now, and he's trying to catch up. And everything he says to do, we've already done. And after about 5 minutes, that's 20 minutes into this operation, he says, we're in trouble. And we thought, that's an amazing observation, Denny. And we kid him about it, but of course he's just trying to catch up with our thinking. We're 15 minutes ahead of him. But he asked, when he found out that he didn't have any knowledge for us, he said, now what can I do? And I said, you can take these throttles and try to help us with the throttles. So what he did is he stood between us, not kneel on the floor as the news media said, and he took one throttle in each hand, and now he could manipulate the throttles together. Since with the number 2 throttle frozen, we couldn't get a hold of the throttles together. Now he could, and we'd say, give us a right bank, or bring the wing up, that's too much bank, try to give us, stop the altitude, and he would respond. And then after about 10 minutes of doing this, whatever we did with the yoke, he could correspond with the throttles. And so it was a synchronized thing between the 3 of us, with Dudley still being able to do all his communications. And so that's how we operated the airplane, and that's how we got it on the ground. And if I can have the slides on now, I'll show you how we got it on the ground. Well, that's why we can't call it a landing. Is this thing on? I moved away from the mic. Can you still hear me? Okay, you can. Okay, this is the pattern we flew. That's a radar tracking that we flew. We are coming along like this, and it just turned back to Dubuque, Iowa when we lost the engine. And this straight line, reasonably straight line that we fly here, is the line of just trying to keep the airplane upright while we figured out what was going on. Somewhere up in here, and I can't quite see it from here, there's 3 very definite slash marks, and those are where the airplane almost went over on its back. As Denny came up and took over and we began to descend, and we determined now that we're going to go to Sioux City, they wanted us to go to Des Moines, and that was 170 miles away, and there's no way we would have been able to keep the airplane in the air that long. So when we declared an emergency and they gave us the nearest suitable airport, it was only 70 miles away. Now we had to get down, and we did that through these series of right turns. Some of these we did, others the airplane did on its own, and all we did was keep it from doing any more. And so we made these right turns. When the National Transportation Board came in to talk to us, they said, why did you make a left turn? And all 4 of us said we never made a left turn, even though I said we're starting a left turn back to the airport. We all 4 swore that we never made a left turn. That looks like a left turn. And what we determined was we remembered then, after a while, we all 4 remembered there was a buildup about right there, and we had to get around that buildup, not go through it. So we did that. This right here is that last 360-degree right turn. We were too low for the radar to pick it up. And then we came in. And oh, I forgot to get this thing. There's the airport at Sioux City, Sioux Gateway Airport. This is runway 22. This is runway 31. What Kevin was trying to do, since we could only make right turns, was bring us in. The city was right down in here somewhere. Bring us in this way, a right turn into the runway. The way things turned out, it's probably good we didn't do it. Had we been able to make the runway, at the end of runway 31 is the Missouri River. So we might have been better off had we not been able to stop or something to land on something like this. When I asked him how long the runway was, he doesn't say so on the tape, but he did tell us how long, 6,600 feet. And then he said at the end is a wide open field. So our scenario was probably what we do is land and hopefully stay on our gear, go off the end of the runway, shear the gear, and be on our belly. If we did go sideways, since we couldn't steer it, and we did have a quartering tailwind that was blowing us left or right across the runway, we might go off into the field and shear it en route. But we kind of hoped that we would do that. We came pretty close to the runway. We got the right wingtip in the center of the runway, the right main gear off to the side. We touched down on the right wingtip, the wing flap fairing, the number 3 engine, which is the one on the right side, the right main gear, and the nose wheel, all pretty much simultaneously. The right wing broke off. That's the reason for the fire here, spilling all the fuel. The right main gear separated from the airplane. The left gear stayed on, and the airplane slammed onto the ground, and we did not hit and cartwheel like all the news says. We hit and slid on the ground on the left main gear and the right wing stub, slid along sideways for about 2,000 feet or so when the left wing came up. Also on impact, the tail broke off. The entire tail section of the aircraft broke off. So there's no weight in the tail at all. So when the left wing came up, probably because of our speed, the tail came up. The aircraft went up on its nose, bounced on the runway 3 times on the nose, leaving radome left marks on the runway. We went upside down and airborne about right here. We're thinking, even that tape that we've seen, that you see there, that's all we have in the way of tape, and nobody really remembers, and there was so much fire and smoke that nobody could really tell. We hit right about in here, upside down, and fortunately for us, the cockpit broke off, and unfortunately for the first class cabin, and then the aircraft went over on its back and skidded to a halt right over here. This is our point of impact, where the right main gear touched down. That concrete is 12 inches thick and the hole is 18 inches deep. You normally land a DC-10 at approximately 140 knots. We were doing 215 knots and accelerating. You normally touch down about 200 to 300 feet a minute at the most as your rate of descent. We were doing 1,850 feet a minute and increasing. And you normally like to go straight down the runway, and we were drifting left to right because of a quartering tailwind of 10 knots, which gave us 10 knots more speed as we hit the ground. I'm showing you these for several reasons. One is to show you that you can survive an airplane crash, because we had survivors in that piece of wreckage. That's the first class cabin. We actually had one of our deadheading pilots who was sitting in the back of the first class cabin go out a window. And I said, "You can't get out a window." He said, "Yes, you can." When you realize you're upside down and the thing's on fire, you can get out a window and get in. So, but we did lose most of these people, unfortunately, but they did survive. Some of them did survive that. This is the tail section of the aircraft, which shows it better here. It broke off and went straight down the runway, while the rest of the aircraft curved off to the right. We had about 3 or 4 rows of seats in here, and 2 flight attendants who survived this part of the accident. I've always concerned about a DC-10. It concerned me that the engine sitting on top of the tail as it was, if the engine blew, you might lose the whole tail. Well, after all that happened to this airplane, that engine housing is still sitting there. So Douglas put that on to stay. There's no question about that. Whoa. That's not very clear. What that is, and I don't know what there's something in front of it. You can't really see it, but that's a much better picture than I don't know what's in front of it there. That's supposed to be just a clear shot. Oh, no. What it is a fuselage. It's the main portion of the aircraft. It's upside down, and it burned, of course, after the fire.
sorry, you have two slides together.
Oh, that's why. Well, it looked like somebody standing. Not me. Who put those in there? Lori's over at the whatever that thing is, the keel cutting or whatever it is. She ran off. So. Oh, there it is. Okay. This is the forward part of the aircraft, and this is the aft portion. And this is where most of our survivors came from. That area right there. Unfortunately, 34 were trapped back in here and died due to smoke inhalation, but most of them came from right there.
Pop that one out.
Now we can go on. That's it. In case you don't recognize that, that's the cockpit. Now you see there's no metal, there's no glass, there's no anything to indicate that's a cockpit. That's why they're guessing about 35 minutes after the crash, we were ignored. They felt that that was an uninhabitable part of the avionics compartment. Because all that was holding that airplane together were the wires. Or holding that piece of stuff together was the wires. This gentleman that you see here in the blue hat, he's talking to me. The gentleman without his hat on is talking to the co-pilot Bill Records, and you can see a little bit of Bill's shirt right there, and the four of us are right there. Now that area is normally about 10 feet high, counting the cockpit and the avionics compartment. That's directly behind my seat, and that's where we are. In their rescue operation, they came in and tried the jaws of life. They put it on Bill's side, and as they did, it put pressure on my side, and I happened to be conscious at the time, and I strongly recommended they quit doing that. So they came over to my side, and they tried my side, and Bill did the same thing. Bill's seat had collapsed, the back down on the seat with him inside of it. So he was really, but he had 8 broken ribs, 2 broken hips, and a broken pelvis. So he was in a little bit of pain. And so what they did is they came up with the idea to bring a forklift over and run the chains, those heavy chains you saw, straight down and lift the cockpit straight up. And by doing that, they raised the cockpit to this height. You see the gentleman standing there, and then pulled us all out the bottom. That's how they got us out of the airplane. And to say a lot for Douglas and the seat manufacturers, that's my seat. All 4 of the seats stayed together. All 4 of the seat belts and harnesses held. They had to cut them out to get us out. It's the only thing that I'm sure that saved our lives was the fact that those belts held. Yep, and that's the slides. But that was the reaction of the crew and how we got the airplane on the ground. How did the ground people react? That up here. Well, the ground crew did exactly what they had been trained to do. By having the advance notice, they were in a position to put all the aircraft or all the emergency vehicles in a spot, in a designated area, and then dispatch them as they were needed. We only gave them 2 minutes to line up for runway 22. They were all set up for runway 31. And when I told Kevin we saw this runway ahead of us and that's where we're going to land, he had 2 minutes to get the equipment off that runway. They were actually positioned on that runway, and we could see them moving off the runway. That's the reason the video is no better than it was. With all this notice that we had, everybody was set up for runway 31. The 2 hangars that are built just off to the left of runway 22 were built after the airport was closed, and you can't see the runway from the tower. And that's where the operator was. So he went tearing down the steps, and if you've ever tried to get down a tower steps in a hurry, it's a long way down, and that's as far as he could get before we got there. The first part of the video was taken by a home video camera, showing us in the air. But that picture in the air is very deceiving. It looks like we have everything pretty much under control. We are starting a down phugoid, and we're starting a right bank, about 300 feet in the air. And that's where I say our luck ran out. We just ran out of altitude, trying to correct it. We had the time in the air to correct it, but that close to the ground, we didn't have time. An attempt to stop the phugoid and the turn, Dennis added power. Unfortunately, the left engine spooled up faster than the right, the first time in the day that we know that it happened, and the bank increased. And we went from 4 seconds, we went from 4 degrees of right bank to 20 degrees of right bank and hit the ground. However, safety experts say that the tumbling of the aircraft probably saved a lot of lives. It took up most of the inertia, most of the shock, and allowed the people to get out of the airplane. But we're talking about reaction now. The emergency crews responded as they had been trained to do. The preparation was the big thing in their reaction time. The tower switching to the Alert 3 way ahead of time really set the wheels in motion to their reaction there was such that they knew it was going to be bad and that they were able to start that motion. We had at the hospital an unusual situation. There were so many doctors there and nurses that the director was trying to figure out what to do with all these people. So he came up with an idea, and he formed a line, and he put a doctor, a nurse, and a technician, and they formed a line. Regardless of the doctor's specialty, it doesn't matter what it was, they'd all had medical training, so that's what they were. They had psychiatrists, they had obstetricians, they had pediatricians, they had everything in this line. And then when they brought the ambulance up and pulled a gurney out of the ambulance, well, this survivor had already been through triage at the airport. He had already had EMC care all the way into the hospital. And now he had a doctor and a nurse and a technician on him immediately. And they stayed with him until they were either sent to a room or released or whatever was done to him. So the emergency care was instantaneous and continuous. And that was through a preparation and a little bit of flexibility that the plan had that they could use in it. The other flexibility in the plan was, where is everybody going to stay? I usually get in trouble with the media for saying this, but with that notice that came out that we were going to go to Sioux City, CNN had broadcast the fact that an aircraft was over Sioux City and on its way in, and it was a problem. And all the news media were very interested in this, and they reserved all the rooms in the hotels in Sioux City. So when the survivors started getting through and being released several hours later, there was no place to put them. And one of the doctors at St. Luke's looked up at Briarcliff College, it sits up here on the hill overlooking Sioux City, and he said, well, let's call Sister Margaret Wicks and see if she can do anything. Well, it was summer. They had a skeleton crew there, a small summer staff on. Yeah, she did something. By nightfall, she had 250 people in her dormitories. That's how quickly she responded. So the reaction of everybody was just fantastic. Which brings us to the fourth thing, that's the fifth one rather, that's cooperation. The cooperation that took place was outstanding, just unbelievable. First of all, we start with us in the cockpit, the team effort with the four of us. This was Dudley Dvorak, the second officer. This is his first month in the DC-10. He had just had his initial operating experience flight, and he was flying for the first time in the 10. Bill Records had flown a lot of 1011s for Pan Am, and he flew 1011s for United when he first came over and then switched to the DC-10. A lot of experience in three-engine aircraft, but of course none in what we were doing. But that was his experience. Mine was, I had about 7,000 hours in the DC-10. I spent 9 years as a co-pilot in the DC-10. I was flying to Honolulu, and as I say, I was getting 14 days a month on the beach at Waikiki at company expense, and I saw no reason to go to work, so I stayed as a co-pilot. But I had a lot of time in the 10. Denny was a DC-10 instructor, but what we didn't know was it was his first or second month as an instructor in the DC-10. But what we had, like I said, was 103 years of experience, and that showed in the way we reacted to the problem, the way we cooperated with each other in getting things done. Everybody throwing out a suggestion. When it came time to put the gear down was one of the big problems we had about, not problems, but the way we use CLR and cooperation with the crew. There's two ways to get the gear down on a DC-10 with hydraulic failure. You can put the gear handle down, that manually unlocks the doors, and the doors fall open and the gear just falls out because it's been resting on the doors. Or there's an alternate method of doing that for when you use no flaps, because we have 4 ailerons in the DC-10. You fly with the inboard ailerons at high speed, and then you unlock the outboard ailerons for landing when you lower the flaps. Well, we didn't have any flaps, so we couldn't unlock the outboard ailerons. That's what this alternate gear method is for. And we talked about this. How do we put the gear down? And it was suggested we unlock with the outboard ailerons, with the alternate gear, because there might be something out there. We might be able to get some fluid out there. I mean, there might be some trapped out there. So this was all talked about. The one thing we all agreed on was the gear was going down. I don't care whether we landed in a farmer's field or landed on a highway or landed on a runway. The gear was going down because we had to have a shock absorber. Something had to absorb that shock. But the rate of descent that we had, I was afraid if we had touched down as we did without the gear, we'd have just exploded. And if we'd had a higher rate of descent than we had, because we had higher rates of descent somewhere during this time than we actually had when we touched down. So the gear was going down, but CLR and cooperation of the crew on how to do it. Cooperation between the cabin and the cockpit crew was very, very good. We had some communications gaps there because of our attention to duty that we could not turn. I never turned around and talked to the flight attendant, looked at her when I talked. In fact, when they took us, the second day after the accident, I was asked to go see the rest of the crew. And they put me in a wheelchair and they wheeled me down to intensive care where Bill and Dudley were, and Bill and Dennis. And as they were taking me to Dennis Fitch's room, this captain who came up to help us, I thought, if there's more than one person in that room, I'm not going to know who he is because I don't know what he looks like. He stood right here for 30 minutes and sat down and worked the throttles for us for landing, and I have the foggiest idea what the man looked like because I never turned around and looked at him. But he was the only one in the room, so it made it a little easy to find out who he was. But that's the way our communications was. We had to communicate without looking at each other, and the A came up and did her thing, went back. The cooperation among her group. The procedure for United Airlines is when you're going to have an emergency preparation, you call all the flight attendants together. The A does, the senior flight attendant. She briefs them, and then they go out to their duty stations and they demonstrate and tell what they want done. Well, when this engine blew, it was so loud and so violent, they even heard it on the ground. Everyone in the aircraft knew. Besides that, I had Channel 9 on, and everyone with a headset on Channel 9 knew we'd lost an engine because they were listening to ATC. Fortunately, I got it off before we got to the really bad stuff. And one of the survivors even commented, we were listening until the captain turned us off, he said. So they didn't know how bad we really were until we told them later. But what Jan decided to do was to go back there and brief each station independently, because bringing everybody together, she thought, would upset the passengers any more than they already were. And by their doing this, the cooperation between them and the passengers was outstanding. It was Children's Day, unfortunately, on United Airlines. We had some 30 children on the airplane, a lot of them traveling by themselves. And what the flight attendants did were ask adults to move so that there was at least one adult sitting next to every child. And the passengers cooperated without hesitation. When they selected the people to sit by the emergency exits, they all responded very quickly. Great cooperation. And when the airplane crashed, after the crash, several of the flight attendants were assisted getting out of their harness by the passengers because they were upside down in their harness as well as their belt, and they couldn't get the belt to loosen. John Transu helped one of them out. Gary Priest, I think it was, helped one of them out. You heard of, I know you remember the story, I'm sure you do if I recall it. There was an infant that was separated from her parents. And one of our survivors, Jerry Schimmel, was just leaving the airplane, getting out of that thing, full of smoke, fire and he heard the baby crying. And he turned around and went back in the airplane, searching for the baby, found her in an overhead bin. She had actually been thrown up into an overhead bin and took her out. So that's the kind of way the passengers responded and cooperated with everybody. I've talked about what ATC did. I've talked about the 185th, how they helped. The surrounding areas, they actually called these outlying cities when we said we may not make the airport and said there's a DC-10 heading your way, coming your way, headed for the airport. And they would actually dispatch trucks out to the highway to look for us so that if they found us and we didn't make the airport, at least there would be somebody there. I'm not familiar with mutual aid too much, but I know it exists. And I've seen pictures where a fire truck is sitting on a county line while a house across the street burns because they don't have mutual aid. Well, they threw mutual aid out the window. They didn't even consider it. That was part of their plan, that we won't worry about mutual aid. We'll have response, and then we'll worry about the mutual aid and who's going to get paid for what they did. And that's the way that they cooperated with each other. Marion Health Center, their North Campus, which is their mental health campus, their emergency or post-traumatic stress program. I was asked, did you get any therapy while you're in the hospital? And I said, no, I don't think so. They said, no psychiatrist or psychologist came? I said, oh, yeah. But all they did was come to the room and talk. And then it dawned on me just exactly what therapy is. When I woke up in the hospital, when I first really remembered what was going on, there was a gentleman holding my hand. And of course, the next thing I looked for was a security guard with my wallet, and he had it in his hand. But this guy was holding my hand, and he said, I'm Dr. Pensy, I'm the staff psychologist. And he was with me from the time I woke up until the last person I saw when I left the hospital before I got in the car was Dr. Pensy. So I had therapy from day one because all of us had guilt complexes, several guilt complexes. One is, as the captain of the flight, I felt a responsibility for the accident. But they had to convince us that really that there wasn't a lot more that we could have done in the airplane to do it. And it took some time because we all had guilt complexes about this. And we all had the why me syndrome. Why did 112 people die and 184 survive? How do we decide who lives and who dies? Why me? Why did I survive? And that's another thing. That's one of the biggest problems of post-traumatic stress. So that's what everybody was working on. But the cooperation there was tremendous. The people of Sioux City, or Siouxland as they like to be called since it's a 4-state area, they cooperated. They headed for the airport immediately. And they didn't go out there to see what was going on. They had with them food, blankets, clothes, wherever they could be sent to take it. They ended up at Briarcliff offering their cars. A lot of people stayed in their homes. A lot of people offered their homes for the night. Does anybody know what that was? I jump at noises, sudden noises now. Anyway, they offered their cars. They took the clothes from the people that were soiled by the dirt of the farmland, took them home, washed them, brought them back. They just did everything. Over 400 people lined up at the blood bank to give blood, and there was no call for blood. There was no announcement that we need blood, get out there. They were there. They had to turn them away. They had so many. A corporation for the people. United Airlines, the cooperation that they gave everyone, I was very impressed with that. A lot of people were upset at first because there weren't enough people from United to take care of the survivors. Well, we have about a 5 or 6 person staff in Sioux City. But what United did was, as soon as they knew this airplane was going to crash, they pulled ticket agents, passenger agents, reservations clerks right off their jobs in San Fran and Seattle and everywhere they could, threw them on the first available airplane without even going home, and headed them to Sioux City. And so by the next morning or the middle of the next day, they had at least one United employee for every family that was there. And I thought that was, and I think any airline does that. I'm not just saying that's United's doing, but the cooperation from United with everyone else and us was good. They kind of turned us over to the union. The Airline Pilots Association and Association of Flight Attendants kind of handled us. That relieved the company of all the responsibility there. One of the biggest responsibilities is the press. We're not in any condition to talk to the press. We are the survivors of this spectacular crash, and so the press wanted to talk to us. The Airline Pilots Association hired a policeman. They put him on my door. They put him on Dudley's door. They didn't need him on Bill and Denny's because they were in intensive care, and you can't get down there anyway. But I often wondered if that policeman was on my door to keep me in or keep the press out. But whatever it was, it worked because they left us alone. Then that's why at the end of 5 days we had to have a press conference, because we had held the press at bay, and they were entitled to an interview and to a talk. And so we held a press conference and did it that way. But the cooperation from the two unions was great. I've talked about how well the passengers did. But the best help, I think, came later. And that came from our families and from our friends. And this is where you can come in. If you know anyone who has had any kind of a crisis, any kind of a trauma in their life. I had a lot of people tell me, I didn't call you because I felt you were going to be so busy and so, that I didn't want to bother you. You're not bothering anybody. If somebody has a crisis or has a trauma, help them, call them, tell them you're there. Maybe they won't talk to you. Maybe somebody else will answer the phone. That's all right. At least give them a call, let them know you're thinking about them, let them know you're concerned about them, because that's part of the healing process. Talking about it is part of the healing process. This is my 52nd speech on 232. And every time I give it, and I've talked to the doctors about this and I asked the psychiatrists about this, every time I give it, I think I convince myself just a little bit more that there wasn't anything else I could do. And it's part of my healing process. To not talk about it, to bury your head in the sand and pretend it didn't happen, you're going to explode someday. So if somebody wants to talk about a trauma, listen to them. If they want you to talk, you talk about it and listen to them. But be there for them and help them. That's very important. Having a response program is very important, and I'll close. I want to make a statement about that as I close, but first of all, they said we had a little time for questions. If any of you have any specific questions you'd like answered, I'll try to answer them for you. Don't get too technical on me now, but if you have some, I'll be happy to try and answer them. Anybody have any? Yes, sir. We're going to ask you to step up to the microphone, so if you don't mind. Now that's going to cut down on the questions, see? That also does that, too, yeah.
What is your personal opinion of the DC-10 aircraft?
I love it. It's a great airplane. I enjoy flying it. I've flown it, I said, for 9 years as a co-pilot, and I'll end up flying it about 4 years as a captain. It's my favorite airplane. It's a pilot's airplane, an old man's airplane. You just have to have one good finger and you can fly a lot of it. You know? So the only thing wrong with the co-pilot, you had to switch hands. It made it kind of difficult. But no, I love it. It's a great airplane. I have every confidence in the world in McDonnell Douglas and in GE. This is something that happened, and it's going to happen to any airplane. It's happened to almost any airplane. Maybe not exactly the same thing, but it's happened to a 47. It's happened to a L-1011, similarly. I love the airplane. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
What do you think of the mandatory age 60 retirement law?
I get that every time. Well, this is kind of not the way to answer your question, but since I'm going to be 60, I think it's great. Yeah. No, I have my own. This is not United Airlines. This is not the Airline Pilots Association. This is not even a lot of my friends. This is just me, my feeling. As we get older, we hate to admit it, but things happen to us. We tend to forget things. We tend to react slowly to things. A young pilot can react a lot faster than an older pilot. He may react wrong. The senior pilot, the experienced pilot, may wait a second and do the right thing. So they kind of balance each other out. But we do things as we get older that I'm not so sure our physicals can pick up. A very dear friend of mine was having trouble remembering things. The crews he was flying with accused him of early senility or drinking on layovers. But when they finally diagnosed him after about a year, they found a tumor the size of an orange in the back of his brain. Right? So all this is going on. Anytime this is happening in this year, he could have had a very serious situation at a very critical time, and we could have had problems. So this doesn't just happen to 50 or 5-year-olds. This happens to 30-year-olds, I know. But until we come up with a very definite way to check all the medical aspects of a person as he gets older, and until we find a way to really check the ability of a pilot. As you get older, you might lose some of your ability rather than gain some, all right? And you can also fake it, right? Any pilot on any given day can pass a check ride. And the best pilot in the world on a given day can flunk a check ride. So when you get into that situation, you get into an extended program of trying to test his competency. So until we have a better way to test the competency and a better way to test the mental and physical aspects of an individual, I think we need an age to stop. I think that's the best way to do it. Let's just pick an age. We're going to hurt some people. I just met the other day or a couple of months ago a guy down in California. He's 82 years old. He just decided it was time to retire as a teacher of acrobatic flying. Okay? And he was sharp as a tack. Didn't wear glasses, could hear, didn't wear a hearing aid and everything else. But he's a freak of nature. He's like, Nolan Ryan. Nolan Ryan, if you're a baseball fan, is a freak of nature. Nobody 42 years old should be able to throw as hard as he does and last as long as he does. And most pitchers don't, right? Yeager is another one. You know, people his age don't have the eyesight that Yeager has and the hearing that Yeager has and all this sort of thing. But there are exceptions to the rule. The rule is somewhere along the line you should stop. Now, I don't care whether it's 60. As soon as I retire, they can make it 65. That's okay with me. But somewhere along the line, we have to have a place to stop. If we can come up with good medicals and good things, then go ahead. But I think the cost and everything else is, we're all looking at the bottom line, and I think that was just not worth it. Anybody else? Yes?
Have you done any commercial flying since?
Yes, I went to work Halloween night, as a matter of fact. 3 months after the accident, I went back to work. Dudley came back, I think, a week later. Bill came back about 2 weeks later. Dennis unfortunately severed a nerve in his hand that controlled the motor function of his hand. And along with that, he broke his arm and they had to put a plate in. Well, while he was, in therapy to fix the arm, the plate broke and they had to redo the plate. And so he was out almost a year just waiting for the arm to heal. But I just found out that all of us are back, including the flight attendants. So I went back to work. I was very anxious to go. I would have gone sooner, but I had to wait to get all the paperwork done. I had a concussion, so the FAA determined I had to have a neurological exam. And they didn't tell us until I was ready to go back to work, so I had to take some extra time to do that. But I've been flying since October of '89. Yeah. Anything else?
What were your injuries?
My injuries? Let me just go over quickly what the injuries were in the crew. Bill, sitting in the right seat, sitting right there, had 8 broken ribs, hips, and a pelvis, as I said. He had internal injuries. He had multiple bruises and contusions. We all had those, a lot of those. But those were his injuries. Sitting right in the jump seat, or in the second officer seat, was the captain, Dennis Fitch. And let me clarify something right there before we go any further. It got out in Sioux City that Denny Fitch came up to take over from Dudley Dvorak because Dudley couldn't handle the job. And that really irritated me. Dudley was just doing what we asked him to do. And we had him turn around and start operating those throttles. If any of you have run through this simulator over here, you know how complicated that is. Dudley did not have time to figure out what the power changes it took. So the second time he added power and was corrected by one of us, he took up to the captain and said, "Do you want this seat? You know what you've been doing here. Do you want the seat?" So that's why the captain was sitting in Dudley's seat. Dudley was sitting in the jump seat. Clear that up. But Dennis's injuries were a dislocated left shoulder, a broken right shoulder, the hand, broken rib, other internal injuries, serious internal injuries. And Dudley suffered a large burn on his right arm. We don't know where that came from. It's the only burn in the cockpit. He smashed his right ankle, had to have 3 pins put in it, and he now has a permanent injury. He's back to work, but he has a permanent injury in that. The rest of us seem to have healed up. Me, I put a 3-inch cut in my right ankle. I bruised my sternum. I bruised 1 rib, and I got 14 lacerations in the head. This ear was almost cut off, and this ear was cut. Took 92 stitches to sew me up, but I didn't break anything. So, varying degrees of injury in that small confine. Excuse me. Some of our flight attendants and a lot of our passengers weren't even hurt. The next day, 5 of the flight attendants walked into my room to go home, and 3 of them looked like they were dressed to go to work. They didn't even get their uniforms dirty. Excuse me. Yes?
Were you aware during the slide out that the airplane had went up on?
No. Was I aware? As soon as we hit the ground, I went out. I have absolutely no recollection of anything from the time we hit the ground until I came to in the cockpit, trying to figure out where I was. And then we had some conversation, and then the operation started, and I was in and out throughout the whole thing. I remember parts of the rescue. I remember parts of the ambulance ride. I don't remember the ride into town at all. I remember being in the emergency room, but I don't remember what was going on in there. I was on my stomach. They kept me on my stomach. They put me on a thing and threw a towel over my head, and I think they were writing me off. I'm not too sure. I woke up with a tag on my big toe. I swear I did. But they always tag each individual, and they put a number on him and a number on a flag wherever they found him, so that and this is what they do. And I guess they didn't have a grease pencil that would write. Dudley, they wrote on his foot, but me, they put it on a tag and put it on my big toe. I saw that, and I get that thing off of there right now. But I don't remember too much about it. In fact, we all were in and out. Bill remembers sliding down the runway, sideways, or on the side like that, and remembering that, thinking something was going to happen, but then suddenly the cockpit filled with dirt, and that's evidently when it started to tumble. And he doesn't recall any tumbling sensation at all. None of them do.
With what you've learned since the crash, if you found yourself in the same position, would you do something different?
Well, after going through this simulator I went through this morning, I probably would. For one thing, the inputs to the controls would be a lot less than we were. We were shoving the throttles up full bore and back again, and it just takes very little movement I'm going to go fly the 720 here, and I think it's going to be a little different, but in the F-15, it's quite a bit of just very little power does it. But basically, I don't think so. I don't know if we'd still try and fly the yoke. Of course, it can't happen now because they've modified the airplane, right? So we will have an aileron, and we'll have leading edge devices, and we'll have flaps, and we'll have slats. I mean, not flaps, but all that. But to do it again, the answer to that at the press conference was, we didn't know what would happen when we did something at the time. And there's no way I'd try to second guess what would happen if we tried something else. But with the knowledge that we have now, I don't think so. I think I would still have, if I were still going to try and fly the airplane, which I would probably do, I would still have somebody operate the throttles. And in fact, that's what they do now. They fly the stabilizer with trim, but they have aileron control. And the best way to do it really is to put one guy on the throttles for the pitch and the other to fly the yoke. So I don't think we do much different, except try to make a little better landing. Yes, sir?
Was fuel transfer tried, or would it be tried nowadays?
It would probably be tried now if you had the time. Now, 41 minutes seems like a long time, but we spent the first 15 minutes just trying to keep the shiny side up, so that we were so busy with that we didn't have time to experiment with anything. I know that Bob and Mimi on the Aloha accident actually had time to fly the airplane and the presence of mind to see how many flaps they could put down, how slow they could fly it, and so forth. This airplane was flying its own speed. We had very little control. And on the Fugoids, we went down as low as 180 knots, and we went up as high as 280 or 200 or 300 knots, somewhere in that thing. So we didn't really have the time to try and see how slow we could go or how we could fly it. I wish we had, but we didn't. Anything else? Yes?
Is McDonnell Douglas looking at any redesign on the isolation of the hydraulic lines that caused...
My understanding is McDonnell Douglas redesigning in any way. My understanding is that the MD-11, as well as the DC-10, is going to be, as the DC-10s are, they're affixed with a fuse in the number 3 hydraulic system. An excessive flow or low quantity in the number 3 system will close that fuse and direct no more fluid to the tail. And the fluid is then directed to one aileron, the leading edge slats, the nose wheel steering, brakes, so forth, so that you can fly the airplane. The tail is now operated off a special motor that drives the stabilizer. It's a flying tail You have no elevators, but you have stabilizer trim. And we had no trim at all in the airplane. So you fly the pitch of the airplane with the throttles and the stabilizer trim, and you can steer the airplane with the ailerons. And as I understand, that's also the fix on the 11. What they're going to do with the 12, I have no idea. Or the 777 or some of those airplanes. They're going to, I think, strictly fly by wire, and I don't know how they're going to do that. I don't even know what that means, really. So. They tried to tell me this morning.
What was your speed when the engine let go?
We were doing 272 knots. We were at cruise, Mach 8.3, 272. And we thought that's the speed the airplane wanted to fly. Excuse me, the engineers told us later that when the engine blew, and the disc and the fan, about 6 feet in diameter, that whole thing went out and tore this big hole in the side of the airplane, the housing, not the airplane. And when that went out, that somehow changed the trim speed to about 215 knots or something like that. Then we put the gear down and got to the lower altitude. The airspeed, or the trim speed was then in effect, and with the burning of the fuel, lowered to another thing. Did I ever answer your question about transferring fuel? I don't remember whether I did or not. We didn't. We thought, well, it's thought about now, but at the time we didn't. And we dumped as much as we could. And the DC-10, you have to have 33,000 some odd pounds left after you dump. It's an automatic shutoff, and you can't stop it. I mean, you can't control it. It's going to stop itself. So, but we had to have that much fuel, unfortunately. Anything else before we go? Yes?
You mentioned CLR being a cockpit standard. Are there ever any emergency situations where a decision has to be made so quickly that you can't use CLR?
The only one I can think of right off the bat that did happen would be, and has to happen to us again, is the Colorado Springs 737, where at about 1,200 feet, he suddenly, in 6 seconds, he went from level, normal flight to over on his back and into the ground. Who's going to make a decision in 6 seconds, I don't know. But that's the only time that you'd have to just, your reaction time would have to be such that, for instance, in our case, Bill's reaction was ahead of mine. And so his reaction was fine. Had we been right close to the ground, one of us would have had to react. But the CLR has got to come in where you have a little more time to discuss. But yeah, it could happen. Okay. Well, I thank you for being here. It's very important to me. I go around now giving these talks, and unfortunately I don't have enough time to sit around and see that we do it in Seattle. But preparation for a disaster is very important. The things you do here at Edwards Air Force Base may prevent a lot of disasters. It will probably prevent this one if we can ever put into use what they're working with right here at Dryden. But you're not going to stop all the disasters, no matter how hard you try. And there's all kinds. There's not just airplane crashes. There's train crashes, there's hurricanes, there's tornadoes, there's certainly earthquakes that can spread disaster over a pretty wide area and require an awful lot of communication and community effort. So having a good, workable emergency plan is very important. On July 19th, 1989, 112 of us, the passengers and crew of 232, did not survive. And I hope you will remember them and think of them whenever you have occasion to recall the events of 232. But 184 of us did. And I think that's due largely in part to the fact that Sioux Gateway Airport and the surrounding communities were prepared to respond to a practiced, organized, updated emergency plan. So what I ask of you, although you probably aren't too familiar with it now, is to go back to your own communities and look into your emergency plans, check with those people that make them, and determine that should such a disaster befall your community, would you be as prepared? And more importantly, if not, why not? Thank you for your time this morning. Appreciate it.